Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. As we all know, there's a lot going on, especially in the news today when it comes to firearms. The recent shooting in a Navy yard has certainly gotten people up in arms, and it seems that every time there is a death that is caused by a gun, the National Rifle Association decides to hold a rally and remind us as American citizens what our rights are to bear arms. Well, joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is author of a book, A Right to Bear Arms. What were the founders thinking? And we thought here on the program today, rather than getting into an emotional and somewhat individual philosophical debate about what this right is, why don't we go back to the beginning and discover what was intended by our founding fathers as this particular right, which seems to be an entitlement, at least in its interpretation, really is all about. And I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today a former Navy veteran who did serve in Vietnam aboard a destroyer, no less. He also earned a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in economics with an undergraduate minor in history. And I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program our special guest, Gerald Peterson. Gerald, how are you?
I'm fine. Thank you for having me.
Well, this is one of those great subjects, where you grow up in school and there's a way that you're taught about certain things, and then someone like you comes along and grabs a piece of that history, goes into detail, and you scratch your head and say, now why didn't they tell us that? I'm sure that must have been that way for you as you were exploring and researching this book about the right to bear arms.
Well, exactly, and what it did, it gave me a lesson.
I'm sure of that.
We have lost touch with our founding era principles and values, our heritage, the whole foundation of our government and our country, and we need to reacquaint ourselves with this. As I did the research, I found out, oh my, there's all kinds of things we should understand about our country that, frankly, we don't today.
Mm-hmm. Now, opening up in your first chapter, I'm sure that this is directly from Amendment 2. It says, a well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, shall not be infringed. So in other words, it's kind of like two sentences, but it's also like one long one all at the same time. And I think what was important, why our listeners should hear that, is that in your first chapter you go into detail about just grammar in general, and what was really going on there.
Yes, I do. And that's something else that we should understand. It opens up all the questions. If people are interpreting the Second Amendment one way, why was it written the way it was written? What does it mean? And then you look at the two clauses, and again, going back to our founding era, Thomas Jefferson was writing an opinion on the National Bank at the time and referred to a rule of construction. And he said if there's a question on a two-part law, you take the interpretation that allows a meaning to both sections, not a meaning that precludes one section from the other. And so I think that's what we have to do here. We have to understand there's two parts to the Second Amendment. Mm-hmm. And the actual right to keep and bear arms is what makes the first clause, the well-regulated militias, effective. Now, how did that all come about? You have to look at the thinking and the fears of the people at the time of our founding era, and that leads you right into all that. You look at people had a great fear, and this goes all the way back to 1688 and 89, the time of the Bill of Rights, the English Bill of Rights. Fear of large standing armies in time of peace. Mm-hmm. People equated large standing armies with tyranny. Any government that had a standing army would eventually end up tyrannical. And how did you protect against this? Well, the states would have militias, and the militias would be the first line of defense in the event of insurrection or an invasion. Therefore, the federal government would not have to have a standing army in peacetime. There's a major reason. This fear was all over. You see it in the discussions at the Constitutional Convention. You see it in the discussions over the debates over the ratification of the Constitution. You see it in the discussions in the first Congress when they were talking about this Second Amendment, or what would be the Second Amendment. The other fear, major fear, was of a too powerful government, a federal government that could wipe out the sovereignty of the states, the identity of the states. If you go back to the American Revolution, when independence was declared from Great Britain, the Declaration of Independence said we would now be free and independent states, not a country, states. And when they wrote the Articles of Confederation for the states to work together in fighting the war against Great Britain, that document said we were simply a league of friendship of free and independent states. So the idea of state sovereignty was very strong, and the fear of the states disappearing or being overrun by a too powerful government also called for the states having a militia. Now you have two major reasons for the states having militias, and you will see this in all of their early state constitutions. Those constitutions that were written from 1776 to 1780 all talked about the need of the states protecting the people. How would they do it? With militias. How would the militias operate? They would be supported by the people of the state, both financially and by service to those militias, and the way the people of the states would serve in the militias would be by having the right to bear arms.
Now, just to add some clarity to that, too, because as you certainly outline in the book what that means, to bear arms, is these would be militias that would have arms for protection. They would also usually be trained, okay? Yep. And in reasonable cases, the arms were probably stored in an armory somewhere that was local, so they weren't really in the houses, unless perhaps you were further away from town because it was more rural than it is today, obviously.
Right.
That was kind of how this, kind of give us some detail on that.
In the earliest days, you look at some of the colonial charters, you'll see there was they had the power to have a militia and have the people armed to serve in the militias. In those early days, the members of the militia would bring their own weapons. Later, it came to be that the states would provide the weapons. They wanted a uniformity of the weapons for the members to have. So they had their armories. They would keep those firearms and other munitions in the state armories, and then when they called their members, militia members, to duty, they would come and pick up the arms. So rather than just keeping the arms at home, they would come and they'd still be able to bear arms, but they were getting the arms from the state. So there's a broad meaning of keep and bear arms.
And the other thing, too, is, according to what you wrote here in A Right to Bear Arms, is that these militias, when formed, could not last longer than 6 weeks.
Yes. It was always a limited time that they would be on duty, even if they were sent out of their state. the state legislature had to approve that, and they would only be gone for a very limited period of time.
Mm-hmm.
If you go forward in time, President Lincoln had a major problem because these militia units would come from the states and they'd only be there for a short period of time. Well, going back to the Revolution, George Washington had this problem too. Militias would come and they'd serve their time and then they would leave, no matter what. He was basically pulling his hair out because he was constantly seeing a turnover in his army.
So this was sort of the early stages of what we now know as the National Guard.
Yes.
Now, just to give people a real perspective on this, originally as this began to start, it had a lot to do with how the early colonials, were leaving England. England was really oppressing them because they were causing, unreasonable taxes, and they didn't have a voice in Parliament. Then they were sending their soldiers over here to America, and they're basically saying, they also have a right to quarter in their house if they need to. And so things were really getting pretty ugly. So it's to take people back into a time where a real threat of war or a real threat of not feeling protected really exists, which is really different from today.
It is quite different. If you take the time period from the end of the French and Indian War, which ended in 1763, until the start of the American Revolution, 1775, you have a period of time in which tension continuously rises. It starts with the Stamp Act in 1765. People didn't like paying the tax that the stamp required. And not only because they just didn't like taxes, these taxes were enacted by Parliament without any representation from the people in America. Mm-hmm. So you have the rise of no taxation without representation. You move continually through this period of time. You have the Boston Massacre in 1770. 5 people in Boston are killed by British soldiers. You have 1773, December, I believe, 16th, the Boston Tea Party. Here's another tax on tea. The British Parliament thought they had outwitted the Americans. The Americans were British subjects who drank tea. Well, they were surprised. The uproar in this country was almost more than the Stamp Act. So much so that when there were 5 British merchant ships in the Boston Harbor, there was a group of people made up from the Sons of Liberty and Indian outfits came on board and threw all the tea in the harbor. Mm-hmm. And you continue on somewhere between that and 1774, the fall, when the First Continental Congress convened. The orders to the British Army changed. Up until that time, they had been there to protect the colonies. Mm-hmm. As of that time period, orders changed. They became occupiers. They were there to maintain law and order. Now, all protection from the British government was withdrawn. You have a talk by Patrick Henry in the First Continental Congress. It was either September or October of 1774, in which he says, "We are now in a state of nature." Well, this sets the whole stage. The state of nature, first written about by John Locke, a 17th century political philosopher, is a condition where there is no government. We are all on our own. We have natural rights of life, liberty, and property. There is no higher authority to adjudicate differences among us. There is no higher authority to protect us. Now, obviously, this can be a very dangerous situation. our number one priority is self-preservation, or as we would say today, self-defense. Anything goes because there's no one else to help you. So this is what Patrick Henry was driving at. Now it was time. Let's get our militias ready. Let's get ready because we've got to protect ourselves.
Right. Go ahead, continue.
Okay.
I knew you were on track.
I'm always afraid I'm going a little too. I can go on and on and on.
No, I know you can, and I'm actually encouraging you to do that. And I'll just jump in if I have a question or think that maybe our listeners need a little more clarity. But you're doing just fine. Keep going, Gerald.
Okay. So this sets the stage. We are now ready for any kind of trouble. We know we're going to have to take care of ourselves. So now we've got to have our militias ready. They are going to provide our first line of defense. As a matter of fact, it actually happened. In April of 1775, we have the situation where elements of the British Army marched out of Boston. They were heading to Lexington. Now, what most people don't know is why were they on the move? They were going after and trying to capture Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who were on their way to the Continental Congress. The British troops got to Lexington, and they ran into the first elements of the Massachusetts militia.
Okay.
Well, in that battle, the militiamen got pretty much mauled. It wasn't a pretty sight. But they didn't find Hancock and Adams, so they moved on to Concord. Different story here. The militia stood up and fought and put a pretty sound whooping on the British soldiers. They still didn't have Hancock and Adams. They now had a whole lot of wounded and a few dead, so they said, let's go back to Boston. So here was our first elements of militia in action. At the same time, the Continental Congress is trying to put George Washington in charge of a Continental Army, and he's got to bring the army together. So they start with the militia people. If you want to go another step here, I was talking about the state of nature, and the number one priority in a state of nature is self-preservation.
Mm-hmm.
Now, people enter into what we now call a social contract. They enter into a society with a governing authority that now adjudicates differences among the people. They now their number one priority of government is to protect the people.
Right, because as you're saying, in natural law, you're looking out for yourself. But if you collectively get with other people, now you're bound by a more group or community or a government law, so to
speak. Yes,
okay.
Exactly.
There you go.
And now your number one priority is no longer self-defense. You've got the government to protect you. You are entitled to defend yourself, but it's now more limited than it was in a state of nature. Now you seek out the government help to protect you. And if that doesn't work, then if you see danger coming, your next responsibility is get away from that danger. Remove yourself from that danger. If none of that works, then you have the right to self-defense. Mm-hmm. But you can't just, if someone's approaching you, just kill them.
Right.
You don't have a preemptive right. Also, if you get in an encounter and that person who has attacked you is now moving away, you don't have a right to kill them. That's called revenge. So there's limitations on self-defense when you're in a society of laws. Much different. This is something people don't understand today. We have stand your ground laws. Well, that's a 180% turnaround from the way people understood self-defense before. And the law, most self-defense laws that were replaced by stand your ground reflected these limitations on self-defense as the people of our founding era understood them. The third idea of self-defense was that of the state or the country or the community defending itself. Once again, here's where we get into the Second Amendment. So there's really three concepts to self-defense, and we need to understand that. When people want to quote something about self-defense, what are they talking about? State of nature? Are they talking about being in a society with a governing authority? Are they talking about the defense of the whole system?
Right. You know, and it's quite interesting. I couldn't help as I was reading this too, because you see such a contrast between the intention and the execution of this amendment in its original form, time in its creation, and what's going on today. And I couldn't help as I was saying that as I'm reading through this book, like watching Hollywood and the interpretation of the Wild West, how if somehow the language or the intention got skewed through the Hollywood lens, so to speak, to bring us to where we have the attitude about it is my individual right to bear an arm, it is my individual right to protect myself, and if that means killing somebody, especially in a situation that clearly there were definitely other alternatives, then so be it, I should be protected, that's my entitlement. Does that kind of sound like the prevailing attitude that we're experiencing today?
This is a total, yes, it is a total misinterpretation of the Second Amendment. Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned the Wild West. If you look back in time, people didn't walk around in their communities carrying firearms. Not at all. The only time that really happened was in the Wild West. And what did we have? Mm-hmm. A lot of violence. But if you look at other communities, people they had firearms. They kept them in their homes. Mm-hmm. They didn't walk around the community with them. Most communities had laws that precluded the discharge of a firearm within their boundaries. Thomas Jefferson, in some letters to friends of his talking about hunting, put limitations. You hunted at the proper time and you hunted in the proper location. People understood there were certain limitations necessary on firearms. They understood the danger of firearms. There was no infringement of the right to own a firearm. Oh, now I just said something. Here's something. If you take a look at the Constitution, you will find nothing in there that gives anybody a right to own a firearm. If you look at the Constitution, you will see nothing in there that precludes anyone from owning a firearm. People in those days owned firearms, or they didn't. Firearms were property, like your clothes, like your desk, like your home. Mm-hmm. It was property. We have in the Constitution in two places protections that say our property cannot be taken from us without due process of law. Mm-hmm. So all this hysteria over guns, I mean, from our earliest time, people could own guns. That wasn't a problem. They recognized there was a need for some limitations because of the danger of guns. Mm-hmm. But it didn't infringe their right to own guns, mm-hmm. and they felt no need to put that into the Constitution. So, but the same phrase, the same sentence that says our property cannot be taken from us without due process, also says that our lives and our liberty cannot be taken from us without due process. Now, one pull of the trigger can take someone's life, certainly without due process. And even the threat of using a firearm can take somebody's liberty or their property from them, again, without due process. So there's a balance in our Constitution about this whole thing about firearms. To me, owning a firearm, fine. You just, all this unlimited carrying of firearms in public, concealed carry, taking them into bars, or arming, taking weapons into schools for protection. This is so beyond rationality. It makes no sense.
Mm-hmm.
Now, okay, the Constitution doesn't say anything about owning firearms or not owning firearms, so what's with the Second Amendment? Mm-hmm. Now we can understand. The Second Amendment's purpose was not to protect individuals. It was to protect states, mm-hmm. pure and simple. And it gave people the right to keep and bear arms in order so the states could maintain militias. Again, to be the first line of defense against foreign invasion or local insurrection, or to protect themselves from a too powerful government. Mm-hmm. That's where the Second Amendment comes from. Mm-hmm. And if we can just understand, it's all right to own a firearm. It's all right to go hunting. It's all right to target shoot. It's all right to maybe be a gun collector. But the unlimited proliferation of firearms in society makes utterly no sense on any basis, constitutional basis, a moral basis. The casualties caused every year are in the thousands. I just read a study that gun violence causes $12 billion a year in health costs alone. I mean,
that's
amazing.
A big number.
and yet, if we just understood, hey, owning a firearm is fine. There needs to be some limitations. Mm-hmm. And those limitations in no way infringe anyone's right to own a firearm.
Mm-hmm. Well, the other thing, too, Gerald, is to take a look at just the words clearly. And I think you really hit upon this. And again, you can't help but see the skewed thinking between what originally was intended and actually written and how it's being interpreted today. And what I mean by that is this. There's a difference between the word own and the word bear.
Exactly, yes. I got in an argument with a fellow lately. He's very much pro-gun. Well, he's a member of the NRA. Mm-hmm. And I said, you know what? I'll give you the Second Amendment. You can have your right to keep and bear arms. But don't you want the right to own arms? And it stopped him in his tracks. When I went on about nothing in the Constitution about owning or not owning, it just stopped him cold.
Mm-hmm. And just like anything else, if you abuse your property toward infringes on the natural liberty, as you said, the safety and the property of someone else, then by natural law, you should lose that privilege.
Yes.
Okay, and that, to me, is like the most reasonable thing you can say to anybody. And I think it's, I don't know, it just becomes so ridiculous that, for instance, when there is a killing, that, like, the National Rifle Association seems to have some kind of, meeting or something right there in the town that it happens. It's like they're just, I don't know, spitting in people's faces rather than dealing with the fact that, well, there's got to be a different way to be looking at this than, keep going in there with the cold, dead hand now of Charlton Heston saying, but this is our right. Well, somebody just took somebody else's right away by taking away their life for no real reason whatsoever, Oh, and it's like the argument keeps getting either lost or washed down, and it's it could be very frustrating, I could imagine.
Well, a lot of that action I see as intimidation. On occasion, you will see a group of folks armed walking around in neighborhoods because they are showing their right to bear arms. Well, that to me is intimidation. And again, if we just get back to our heritage, get back to our founding era principles, we could just lower the rhetoric immensely. There's a place, if you want to own a firearm, fine, but why are you able to take it into a bar? That to me is the last place anybody should be taking a firearm. Why should you take it into a public park? Why should you take it into anywhere other than a shooting range? Fine, go ahead, target shoot. But let's understand the dangers of firearms and have some reason in the discussion. There's no infringement. You look at a registration requirement. Where does that infringe on the right to own a firearm? It doesn't. It recognizes the danger of firearms. So there has to be a registration. You have to have a registration for your car. And you can even lose your license for driving your car if you've been reckless or whatever. Why not with a firearm? Let's recognize the danger of firearms and the proper place of firearms. If you want a firearm, fine. But let's keep it in your house. Take it to the shooting range or whatever. One of the points I make in the book at the end is, in our early days, we were mostly a rural country, an agricultural country, wide open spaces. We were on the frontiers. There was lots of danger out there. But now we're mostly in cities, and the danger, if anything, is coming from having all these firearms within the cities ready to shoot and kill people.
Now, the other thing, too, when we get back to the original amendment that we're talking about here, it's A Right to Bear Arms is the name of the book, and our guest today, Gerald Peterson. And Gerald, getting back to what you were writing about in here, the other thing, too, as we go back to the origination of all of this, was that we were in a perpetual or a feeling state of war because of, King George III and the British armies and the way they were oppressing the colonials back in those days. But that was that. But there was also, if the federal government became too big, because you take a look at first, the amendment allows you self-protection in a natural law environment where there is no other protection. That makes sense. But if you have that protection, which is protection by the state, the governing body, then that starts to really restrict this right quite a bit, to where you've got to use a lot more reason, because you no longer need to worry about protecting yourself because you are protected.
Right.
Now, if that government in that state gets out of hand, then, of course, the people have the right to say, well, we're throwing these guys out, and we're going to set up a new government. Now, that same thing happens to the level on the federal level as well, that the federal level's job was to protect the states, and then, international affairs, as you talk about in the book. Now, what's really interesting is to take a look at the state of our federal government, especially in today's world with the Patriot Act. And I know that you had cited particular cases where the Second Amendment in the book went up against the courts, to basically started working on interpretation. But there was one that's, to me, kind of been covered and forgotten about, that I always find should be important for people to understand, and because this was an abuse of federal government power, and that's what happened in Waco, Texas, with the David Koresh compound. Is that a case you're familiar with?
Not overly, no.
Okay. So here was this compound. A lot of people made a lot of jokes about the burning of, the Koresh compound in Waco, Texas. But in taking a real look at what happened down there, the federal government, of course, they had started sort of a new government cell, sort of like a narcotics, if you will, cell by Janet Reno, who at that time was head of the director of the FBI, decided they wanted to test out this cell, and they decided to do it down in this compound where here the Koreshas, which were a Christian group, minding their own business, practicing their religion, not bothering anybody in the community, in fact, was pretty much well respected by the community. These guys go down there and start getting real nasty, and they start shooting. Okay? So what do? The Koresh compound, the people pulled out some of their arms, and 3 of those officers got killed. It was decided by the United States government as they went in on trial on this that they were clearly protecting themselves and were acquitted of all charges. So then the government says, well, we don't like that. We've lost 3, officers. We're going in for some payback, and then that's when all hell really broke loose. But that was a clear abuse of federal power, even though this particular compound protected itself as what you're talking about with this U.S. Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty fascinating stuff. So even then they realized back in that day when this amendment was occurring that our own government, we had to have checks and balances from that to have protection from that as well.
Oh, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
You read the debates at the Constitutional Convention. They're constantly talking about checks and balances and how not to let the government have too much power.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a major line of debate over the ratification of the Constitution. The framers gave in the proposed Constitution powers to the government to tax, borrow, regulate commerce, raise an army, raise a navy, even call the state militias to national service in the event of invasion or insurrection, and power to regulate and train the militias. Well, the Anti-Federalists said, well, this is way too much power, and a federal government of that nature could, again, make our sovereignty of the states disappear.
Mm-hmm.
And so, again, they wanted to make sure that the states had control of their militias to offset that power.
Mm-hmm.
And when you talk about, when you were going on Waco, you had just prior to that mentioned basically the idea, the right of resistance. And this is a concept, again, from John Locke, that 17th century political philosopher, that if a government, you've joined in a society with a government that's supposed to protect your natural rights, and all of a sudden, if that is a tyrannical government and your rights are in danger, you have a right to change that government or even resist. And as I mentioned before, the British government withdrew the protection of the British Army from the American colonies. They were now there as occupiers, so the colonies were very much in danger.
Mm-hmm.
All these other laws being passed without representation were endangering the colonies. And when they did declare independence, and they wrote the Declaration of Independence, here you have what I call a legal brief. Here is a document that they are explaining to the world what they are doing and why. And they refer to the right of resistance.
Mm-hmm.
And they're making it very clear that they are not resisting the British government simply because of differences of opinion. They are resisting for self-preservation. They believe they are in danger, and that's why they were resisting, and that is a major reason they wrote that Declaration of Independence.
Mm-hmm. I think what's also fascinating, too, that you bring up in this book is when you talk about the idea of the right to bear arms, That really didn't occur, from my understanding, until the middle of the 20th century with the U.S. versus Miller. This is 1939. Tell us about that a little bit.
Well, I cite three early cases, Supreme Court cases. All of them turned on the idea that weapons were connected to militias or the military, and Miller. It was an issue about a sawed-off shotgun being transported across state lines, and got into how the Second Amendment was actually to protect the states. The idea of bearing arms, again, was for the purpose of being in a militia.
Right.
That's the concept that the court followed in those early cases. The most recent cases, they turned around 180 degrees from that. And now they're saying, well, we're going to forget about the militias. The idea of keeping and bearing arms means that you have a personal right to have a firearm and to defend for the purpose of self-defense. That was the essence of the Heller decision, and it was followed up in the McDonald decision in a little different way. McDonald didn't even cite the Second Amendment, but incorporated it through the 14th Amendment. Again, a lot of legalese there that I don't need to muddy up the water with, but those two cases turned completely around the earlier Supreme Court decisions on the Second Amendment.
Mm-hmm. What did you find, Gerald, as you researched this book, to be one of the most fascinating aspects of it that probably surprised you in the whole thing?
Wow. Lots.
I mean, when you get to the basics of what you wrote here and you're like, that's what they meant, that makes a heck of a lot of sense, and it really doesn't apply today. But we want to force the issue to apply to today's world, and it's not even necessary.
Now, well, you just answered the question. That's exactly right. What's all the argument about? We've always had a right to own firearms.
Right.
Citing the Second Amendment to do it is missing what the Second Amendment is all about. The Second Amendment was for an entirely different purpose. What is the big issue today? Why is the rhetoric so caustic? Why are tempers so high?
You know, the only thing I could...
Firearms, you can have firearms, but let's recognize the danger of firearms. Actually, as I understand the original purpose of the NRA was to support the gun safety. Public safety should be what it's all about, not infringing anyone's right. But again, you go back to you lose your license for driving a car if you do stupid things, but that doesn't infringe your right to own a car. And we should deal with firearms the same way. They're dangerous, and we need to take some proper precautions with firearms. That doesn't infringe anyone's right to own a firearm. So, again, if I keep going back to our founding era principles, our heritage, we need to reacquaint ourselves with our heritage, with what these founding folks came up with. They were pretty smart. And we have just so drifted away. We can't even make our government work today. We have incredibly, I think, insane arguments over firearms, which, if we just use some reason, we can accomplish things without hurting anybody's rights.
Mm-hmm.
But let's not use the Second Amendment for it. That has nothing to do with it.
Mm-hmm.
Let's use reason and be rational about it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm sure as people pick up a right to bear arms and find out what our founding fathers were really thinking, perhaps putting some of that reason back into our thinking rather than listening, as you said earlier, to the rhetoric or the news, for instance, and all these interpretations of opinions is what it all really comes down to, and get back, what did it actually say, and understand, what does it actually mean? Perhaps reason will permeate throughout our society, and we'll start scratching our heads saying, what was the debate for in the first place,
Yes.
And it's really kind of crazy that way. Gerald, is there a website people can find out more?
Well, for one thing, they can get a hold of my book online at exlibris.com and amazon.com and barnesandnoble.com. I have my own website, strangely enough, called A Right to Bear Arms, What Were the Founders Thinking?
Mm-hmm. I know that there seems to be this growing concern that our own government is trying to find, and again, these are just opinions. We don't know how true a lot of these stories you hear are, but they're trying to find ways behind closed doors to strip citizens from even having arms in the first place, which is an infringement on the natural law of property, as you were talking about in the book. And some of it is even getting, and who knows, again, it's a stretch of the imagination, that some of these shootings are occurring because people are actually being placed in situations to do this so the government can actually say, see, it's because of this, we need to put a stop to it, so we're stripping everybody, only we should have the guns, I guess. And you're hearing a lot of this kind of stuff going on out there, and you kind of, well, how true is this, and is it even possible?
I can honestly say I have not heard that, but it makes me think we were also warned way back in our founding era by a number of people about factions and factious leaders.
Mm-hmm.
And by factions, they meant political parties, ideology, self-interest groups. Factious leaders would be leaders of those groups, or in today it would be various media pundits. Mm-hmm. Now, we see all kinds of things being said, and quite often without any factual support at all. And this is also continuing to maintain the high temper level. Again, we need to get back to reason. They said factions and factious leaders were dangerous to our country, and we're seeing it today. Mm-hmm. We're seeing it today. Again, using reason. Now, which brings me back to our founding era. At that time, most people thought there were three attributes necessary on the part of the people for a Republican government to function successfully. They called one virtue. That was love of country. That meant devotion to country, respect for your country, your government, your laws, and for each other. Second one was honor. This was the big one with George Washington. This really meant duty to country. Being a good citizen, serving in the government if called on, serving in the military, just being a good citizen. That mm-hmm. was duty to country. Third one, just what we've been talking about, reason. Using factual basis to make decisions rather than the passion of ideology. Mm-hmm. So if we get back to those three, and reason, above all else, we need some reason. Find out the facts. to me, a continuing joke is, well, I read it on the internet. Oh, you did? And I suppose that's true.
Well, I've even been known to quote on this program that the internet is nothing more than the bathroom wall of the world. Anybody who's got an opinion or can type something, there it is.
Absolutely. So one thing I'm very careful of is what are the sources I'm using? What are the sources that are being thrown out at me? I make very sure, and what I try to do, I try to stay away from what these pundits are putting out. If they're talking about the Constitution, I'm going to read the Constitution, or I'm going to read the debates at the Constitutional Convention, or I'm going to read the debates over the ratification of the Constitution. I'm going to do that rather than listen to these pundits, what they have to say. You just have to watch out. Also, here's another thing I've learned to watch out for. Quotes.
Oh my, forget about it.
Quotes a sentence that so-and-so said. You can't imagine how many quotes I've looked up, and when I read the entire text, it was an entirely different meaning.
Imagine 15 years of broadcasting, which I've been doing, and you become so familiar with the other side of the mirror that I've come to think this, okay, if you want information, you go to the library, okay? But if you want to support your opinion and your beliefs, watch the news.
That makes a lot of sense. Well, it doesn't make a lot of sense, but it does at the same time, yes.
Well, that's what we strive to do here on the program, is to try to get to a core so a person can say, well, I think I've got a starting point to pursue this, to understand it better. And I hope that we've achieved that here today with your book, A Right to Bear Arms, just to clearly get back to what did they actually say, and what was the time period like when this was actually enacted. And I hope that we paid you some justice on that here today on the program.
Well, and I appreciate the opportunity to just ramble on and on and on about this. As you can tell, I'm rather passionate about it.
Absolutely, and we love passion on the Beyond 50 radio program, if it impassions others to do the same thing. So, again, the book is A Right to Bear Arms, What Were the Founders Thinking? And our guest today, Gerald Peterson. Gerald, one more time, give out your website information.
It's A Right to Bear Arms, ? What were the founders thinking? ?
That seems simple enough. Gerald, thank you so much for joining us here on the program. What a treat.
Thank you for having me.
You betcha. We also encourage you to visit us at our website, beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. We'll have some hot links up there for you to find out more about this as well. Also, be sure to become a member. Sign up for our weekly exclusive updates, and you'll find out more about what's going on in the Beyond 50 community. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past